Yeah, you're live now. Just click go live.
All right. I think we're live. We're live on Zoom. We're live on YouTube. Fabulous.
Just a second, just to check. Sorry. Oh yeah, now we're live. Yeah, now we're live.
All right.
Okay, sorry, you can start over again. Sorry, people.
All right. So yeah, I was just getting through the introduction, giving a sense of the school materialist research. Um, and yeah, the SMR was founded by the Center for Philosophical Technologies at Arizona State University, the Institute of Social Sciences and Humanities Skopje, the Department for Architecture Theory and Philosophy of Technics at TU Vienna, and the Critical Inquiry Lab at the Design Academy Eindhoven. The SMR is an exceptional global hub for education, research, and experimentation at the nexus of the humanities, social sciences, creative fields, and the STEM sciences. So we're well pleased you found it fit to spend your time, your Saturday, coming from around the globe to share space with us tonight. And in that spirit of sharing space, though online today, we wanted to make sure the SMR Summer Institute happening in person at the SMR campus in Olympiada, Greece was on your radar. Since the application deadline is soon, and so you should submit now, we especially wish to draw your attention to the Summer Institute program, Death, Movement, Change, and Transformation, the Domain of Matter, with John Maliarca, Joel White, and Jonathan Fardy, all authors with important works on Marx. That'll take place September 15th through the 22nd. Statements of motivation to ensure your place in the program are due 10 days from today on February 27th. Have some Cipro and continue to build your theoretical work with us there and then. I'll drop a link to the application page in the chat, both on Zoom and on YouTube Live. Let us know if you have any questions. And with that, and without any further ado, I will turn things over to Reid for him to take us on today's journey on Marx and Engels from 10,000 BCE to 1843 CE.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm just going to kind of dive right in. I have a lot of material to cover, but I did want to just note right off the start that, as you can tell by looking at the outline of the program, the series of lectures, this is a very ambitious undertaking on my part. It's my attempt to essentially give a summary form to a research project I've been working on for a very long time. A previous product of that same research was presented to the School of Materialist Research a few years ago, as well, in a lecture I gave titled Why Was Marx's Materialism Dialectical?, which really goes hand in hand with this material. I believe that's available to members of the school. I'm not exactly sure how that works, but I believe it is available in some capacity if you'd like to see that as well. It's a very ambitious undertaking, and I inevitably over-prepared, as I tend to do. I have probably more material than I'll be able to cover. I'm going to do my best to get through it. I also, unfortunately, fall short of what I anticipated the first lecture covering, so it doesn't quite go the full way. It gets about halfway through what the outline has. I'm going to do my best to kind of compress what is missing in the next lecture. So I'll do my best to keep along track with that outline, but we'll see how things go. I'm not very good at being concise. So, okay, without further ado. So this first lecture is titled The Problem of Marxism it's titled Marx and Engels and the Revolutionary Dialectic of History. Today, Marxism is generally understood by its proponents and detractors alike in terms of two mutually contradictory interpretations. Often, the very same people hold both of these seemingly incompatible positions. Avowed Marxists will deny, or attempt to explain away the contradiction, while opponents of Marxism attribute the contradiction to Marx himself, evidence of his intellectual and political incoherence. The contradiction can be exhibited by way of reading two different inflections into the famous 11th thesis on Feuerbach. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. On the one hand, emphasis is given to the role of the philosophers, the role of theory, whereas they have only interpreted the world. The point of philosophy, and hence the purpose of the philosophers themselves, is not merely to interpret the world, but to change it. Rather than remaining content with passive reflection, theory ought to give direction to practice as a higher form of practice to which the others should be subordinated. The problem is not inherent to philosophy, theory, interpretation, but resides in the fact that the world is not determined according to rational thought, but in a haphazard, chaotic, irrational manner. According to the alternative inflection, the philosophers are to be deprecated in the name of the primacy of practice. They only interpret the world rather than struggling to change it. Philosophy, representing the autonomy of theory, the freedom of thought, the concern with truth for its own sake, is regarded with suspicion as concealing particular practical motives, namely those of the ruling class. In reality, theory is always subordinate to practical necessity, and moreover should be subordinated to a different practical necessity. It presently serves the preservation of the status quo, but it ought to serve revolutionary practice. Theory should therefore be stripped of its pretensions to autonomy, and those who practice it ought to decide what practical end they serve. They must be made to answer, which side are you on? Thus, from one standpoint, practice should be subordinate to theory, voluntarism. Theory thereby becomes the fundamental practical concern, what the classical Marxist tradition regarded as sectarianism. From the other standpoint, theory should accept subordination to practice, determinism. Practical necessity is raised to the level of a theoretical principle, what that tradition called, what the classical Marxist tradition called opportunism. In the first case, Marxism supposedly regards theory as the basis of a political voluntarism in which an intellectual elite gives marching orders to the working class, ordering the passive element of revolution to bring about its utopian vision by imposing a dictatorship on the rest of society, the dictatorship of the proletariat, thus amounting, as Bakunin warned, to a dictatorship of the Marxist intellectuals over the proletarians themselves. To become a material force, theory must grip the masses, that is, turn the masses into its instrument. The workers thereby become cannon fodder for the aspirations, or better put, delusions of grandeur of the philosophers. In the second case, Marxism supposedly demands the subordination of theory to practice, which is justified through its ostensible economic determinism and class reductionism. If it is social existence that determines consciousness, then the social existence of the working class ought to determine their consciousness, rather than that of the ideologists. Moreover, this consciousness is less significant than the actual working class struggle itself, and should flow from it, as science flows from the investigation of material reality, rather than from abstract ideas. Thus, Marx's theoretical contributions, historical materialism, dialectical materialism, the critique of political economy, are only true instrumentally and pragmatically insofar as they serve and are thereby validated by the progress of the working class struggle. They are to serve this end, above all, in affirming the inevitability of the proletariat's victory. Struggle continues, regardless of what might appear to be setbacks, mistakes, defeats, failures. Even the idealism of Hegel is affirmed in this materialism, in that the cunning of reason acts in and through the vicissitudes of the historical process like an invisible hand. The theorists should learn from and take direction from the real movement rather than standing aloof and aspiring to dictate its course. Insofar as the movement appears to be led by such a dictator imposing Marxist ideology upon the masses from above, this is only in the eye of the beholder, a distorted perspective alien to the working class, for the leadership is only serving the masses, subject to a historical necessity that the masses embody in their very material existence as the labor on which social production depends. Moreover, it often appears that Marxists hold these two conflicting beliefs to be true simultaneously. For anti-Marxists, this is the model of Orwell's doublethink. Avowed Marxists, by contrast, regard this fact as reflecting the great theoretical advancement of Marxism, its dialectical ability to synthesize contradictory positions. In this series of lectures, I intend to demonstrate that these tendencies to subordinate theory to practice or practice to theory do not reflect an inherent incoherence of Marxism, whether the Marxism of Marx and Engels themselves or of their immediate followers. On the contrary, these tendencies have resulted from the crisis of Marxism that began in the aftermath of the death of Engels with the revisionist dispute, and that culminated in the period between 1914 and 1919 with the failure of the Marxist leadership of the proletarian socialist movement to overcome its crisis. As a result, Marxism fractured and progressively disintegrated, and its fragments degenerated, both with respect to their ideological self-consciousness and their organizational embodiments. This crisis manifested in theoretical controversies and practical dilemmas, the resolutions of which were ultimately botched. And moreover, these failures were precipitated by and further intensified the breakdown of what was most fundamental for the Marxism of Marx and Engels themselves, the dialectical relation between theory and practice. Explaining the causes and consequences of the crisis and breakdown of Marxism are beyond the scope of this course, but as this historical fact is the impetus of my interest in the titular concern of the series, I will begin by tracing the source of the problem back to the historical context of Marx and Engels themselves, out of which Marxism arose as an attempt to clarify the problem and thereby contribute to its ultimate resolution. The crisis and breakdown of Marxism reflected the failure of the effort to resolve this problem and the consequent adaptation of the proletarian socialist movement, and even of Marxism as an ideology, to this failure as a means of making peace with it. This was the liquidation of the fundamental concern without which Marxism becomes incoherent, both in theory and in practice. Marxism requires illumination because the historical memory of Marxism was deeply compromised by its failure and subsequent disintegration, not only in the sense of the memory of Marx's theory and the history to which it gave theoretical reflection, but also the memory embodied in the remnants of Marxism as an organized political movement, This memory has suffered from a deep regression, distorting both how we think about Marxism today and the practical forms in which the struggle ostensibly continues. Yet it is not only with respect to Marxism that the theoretical and practical consciousness of history, which is to say, the consciousness of freedom, has regressed. The dynamic of capitalism as a form of social development, as Marx observed, is fundamentally ambivalent, simultaneously progressive and regressive. Marx held that the working class, in order to emancipate itself from a condition in which social progress took the form of progress in the domination of labor by capital, and which hence confronted them as the regression of bourgeois freedom to a slavish existence, would have to sharpen this ambivalence into an explicit contradiction so that it could be clearly grasped, worked through, and ultimately overcome. In the words of the Communist Manifesto, the proletariat, the class of laborers who live only so long as they find work, and who find work only so long as their labor increases capital, are compelled to simplify the class antagonisms, the complicated arrangement of society into various orders and manifold gradations of rank, to spring the whole superincumbent strata of official society into the air by organizing itself into a class and consequently into a political party, leading the self-conscious independent movement of the immense majority in the interest of the immense majority, in the more or less veiled civil war raging within the existing society, up to the point where that war breaks out into open revolution, an open fight that can only end either in the revolutionary reconstitution of society at large, or in the common ruin of the contending classes. Marx would later criticize that class of philanthropists and even of socialists, what the manifesto calls conservative or bourgeois socialists, or whom the manifesto calls conservative or bourgeois socialist, whose great aim consists in finding out a method of securing permanent average wages, which Marx noted was put out of the question by the industrial cycle of boom and bust. He continues, I am on the very contrary convinced that the alternative rise and fall of wages and the continual conflicts between masters and men resulting therefrom are, in the present organization of industry, the indispensable means of holding up the spirit of the laboring classes, of combining them into one great association against the encroachments of the ruling class, and of preventing them from becoming apathetic, thoughtless, more or less well-fed instruments of production. In a state of society founded upon the antagonism of classes, if we want to prevent slavery in fact as well as in name, we must accept war. In order to rightly appreciate the value of strikes and combinations, we must not allow ourselves to be blinded by the apparent insignificance of their economical results, but hold above all things in view their moral and political consequences. Without the great alternative phases of dullness, prosperity, overexcitement, crisis, and distress, which modern industry traverses in periodically recurring cycles, with the up and down of wages resulting from them, as with the constant warfare between masters and men closely corresponding with those variations in wages and profits, the working classes of Great Britain and of all Europe would be a heartbroken, a weak-minded, a worn-out, unresisting mass whose self-emancipation would prove as impossible as that of the slaves of ancient Greece and Rome. Later still, Marx warned the First International that should the workers renounce their resistance against the encroachments of capital and abandon their attempts at making the best of the occasional chances for their temporary improvement, they would be degraded to one level mass of broken wretches past salvation. By cowardly giving way in their everyday conflicts with capital, they would certainly disqualify themselves for the initiating of any larger movement. As Marx pithily summarized, the working class is revolutionary or it is nothing. According to the manifesto, the bourgeoisie demonstrates that it is unfit any longer to be the ruling class in society and to impose its conditions of existence upon society as an overriding law as soon as it proves incompetent to assure an existence to its slave within his slavery, because it cannot help letting him sink into such a state that it has to feed him instead of being fed by him. So long as the slaves remain content in their slavery, they will likewise demonstrate they are not yet fit to rule, to become masters of the productive forces of society by abolishing their own previous mode of appropriation, namely wage labor. Since the collapse of the proletarian socialist movement in the early 20th century, capitalist class rule has maintained itself precisely by securing the workers against positive want to the extent necessary to keep the slaves content enough with their slavish existence, thereby rendering their self-emancipation impossible and disqualifying them from initiating any larger movement. Not only the working classes, but the whole of society has thereby been reduced to a common ruin, degraded and decayed into one level, passively rotting mass of broken wretches past salvation. Society finds itself put back into a state of barbarism, a universal war of devastation, requiring the enforced destruction of masses of productive forces, including masses of human beings, rendered superfluous. The collapse of the proletarian socialist movement, therefore, also destroyed the clarity of the contradiction at the heart of the capitalist mode of production, collapsing progress into regression, so that social life in general seems on the one hand, in a state of constant, unmanageable flux, and on the other, to be frozen into an unchanging and unchangeable status quo. The only means of rendering such a state of affairs intelligible is to cling to forms of thought and of social existence by which the destructive upheaval can be held at bay, and to condemn incompatible forms that threaten to undermine those on which we depend, as themselves deserving of destruction. We desperately try to anchor ourselves in the midst of universal degeneration to forms of life whose progress requires the domination and subordination of other forms and the destruction of whatever will not submit. This authoritarian pattern in which the virtue of the forms through which we distinguish ought from ought not rests only on their efficacy as means of domination, of compelling stasis and stability in the face of the everlasting uncertainty and agitation that results from the constant revolutionizing, the uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, means of conserving in unaltered form some fixed, fast frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions, which even when new formed, nonetheless become antiquated before they can ossify. This authoritarian and barbaric form of life amounts, from Marx's perspective, to a retreat, a regression from the characteristically revolutionary dynamics of the bourgeois epoch. It is, in a word, reactionary. By this means, we try to blunt the anguish of confronting with sober senses our real conditions of life. seeking to mitigate naked self-interest and callous cash payment as the sole nexus between man and man, to warm the icy water of egotistical calculation with heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, chivalrous enthusiasm, Philistine sentimentalism, and whatever other religious and political illusions will serve. To do away with that single unconscionable freedom, free trade, and insist upon a semblance of personal worth by reinstating the numberless, indefeasible chartered freedoms and other such idyllic relations that bourgeois society, by its very essence, is driven to put to an end. Marx writes in the Grundrisse that in all earlier epochs, with the exception of the few trading peoples, wealth does not appear as the purpose of production, as an end in itself, but only a means of creating the best citizens. Quote, in all these forms, the basis of development is the reproduction of presupposed relationships between the individual and his community. Relationships more or less naturally evolved, or else historically developed, but become traditional, and a specific objective existence, predetermined for the individual, both as regards his relation to the conditions of labor and his relation to his coworkers, fellow tribesmen, etc. The development, therefore, is from the outset a limited one. But once the limit is transcended, decay and ruin ensue. It's precisely from the decay and ruin of feudal society that modern bourgeois society sprouted. Yet despite the most revolutionary part it played historically, the bourgeoisie proved unable to do away with these class antagonisms, to sweep away the ruins. The bourgeoisie finds itself involved in a constant battle, in ceaseless collisions with the other classes of the old society, seeking to protect and restore these ruins of bygone social forms, initially with remnants of absolute monarchy, the landed aristocracy, the non-industrial bourgeois, the petty bourgeois, and later on with those portions of the bourgeoisie itself, those interests whose interests have become antagonistic to the progress of industry. Thus, the revolutionary bourgeoisie, as well as its reactionary opponents, find themselves compelled to appeal to the proletariat to ask for help, and thus to drag it into the political arena, each supplying it with its own elements of political and general education, as the means of uniting the proletarians into more compact bodies, and to set the whole proletariat in motion in pursuit not of its own ends, not of the proletariat's own ends, but the political ends of the class standing at the head of the movement. With the emergence of socialism properly so called, namely the critical utopian socialism of Henri de Saint-Simon, Charles Fourier, and Robert Owen, this dynamic was altered. The socialists recognized the persistence of the class antagonisms, as well as the action of the decomposing elements in the prevailing form of society, and sought after a new social science, after new social laws, by which to bring about the material conditions for the emancipation of the most suffering class, the proletariat, as well as to improve the condition of every member of society, even that of the most favored. Yet due to the relatively low level of development of industry in the first decades of the 19th century, they could not anticipate that as it further progressed, so too would the development of class antagonism, driving the proletariat, which in its infancy appeared without any historical initiative of its own, to form an independent political movement, pursuing their own ends by means of revolutionary action. Hence, the utopian socialists, were unable to grasp the actual historical dynamic at work in this early undeveloped period, and could only substitute fantastic conditions for historically created conditions, and personal inventive action for historical action. Nonetheless, such fantastic pictures of future society, painted at a time when the proletariat is still in a very undeveloped state and has but a fantastic conception of its own position, corresponded with the first instinctive yearnings of that class for a general reconstruction of society. They, moreover, contained a critical element in that they attacked every principle of existing society and proposed practical measures that pointed to the disappearance of class antagonisms, which were, at that time, only just cropping up, and which, in these publications, are recognized in their earliest indistinct and undefined forms. The development of the proletarian class struggle, these fantastic socialist systems lost all practical value and all theoretical justification, but they were nonetheless the critical basis upon which the proletariat began to develop consciousness of its own class position. This new social science would therefore advance through the clarification and revision of their revolutionary ideas. Yet their disciples, the disciples of the original socialists, in every case formed mere reactionary sects, meaning their disciples beyond the proletariat, their bourgeois disciples and petty bourgeois disciples. They formed mere reactionary sects, holding fast by the original views of their masters in opposition to the progressive historical development of the proletariat, thereby deadening the class struggle. They hold to the letter of the utopian system, or they held to the letter of the utopian systems, and thereby betrayed their revolutionary and scientific spirit. They thus created the basis for, and themselves sunk into the category of, the conservative and reactionary forms of socialism. Attempts I seem to have botched that a little bit. I apologize. Attempts to present the conditions of existence of the various classes of the old society. Let me roll back a second. So the conservative and reactionary forms of socialism attempt to present the conditions of existence of the various classes of the old society, the aristocracy, the petty bourgeoisie, the intelligentsia, and the bourgeoisie itself, as the conditions of the emancipation of the proletariat. As the proletarian class struggle developed beyond its elemental stages and began to grope toward consciousness of its conditions and ultimate aims, it found the socialist literature, educational activity, and experiments to be instrumental. But for this reason, socialism became the pretense upon which the various contending classes each sought to recruit the proletariat to their own cause. The original utopian socialists gave intellectual expression to the crisis of the bourgeois revolution. Bourgeois ideology, in giving birth to socialism and in preparing the proletariat for their own revolutionary struggle, thus became a decisive revolutionary force directed against the bourgeoisie themselves. This culminated in the very process through which Marx and Engels entered the fray and made their own contribution, which they recount in the manifesto as follows. This is the kind of the self-insert of the authors in the manifesto, if you will. In times when the class struggle nears the decisive hour, the progress of disillusion going on within the ruling class, in fact, within the whole range of old society, assumes such a violent, glaring character that a small section of the ruling class cuts itself adrift and joins the revolutionary class, the class that holds the future in its hands. Just as, therefore, at an earlier period, a section of the nobility went over to the bourgeoisie, so now a portion of the bourgeoisie goes over to the proletariat, and in particular, a portion of the bourgeois ideologists, who have raised themselves to the level of comprehending theoretically the historical movement as a whole. That's Marx and Engels. Socialism emerged out of the reflection, from the standpoint of the revolutionary bourgeoisie, of the crisis and self-contradiction of bourgeois society, of the bourgeois revolution, resulting from the rise of large-scale industry. This revolution had seemingly broken the pattern of all history hitherto. The old form of life was being negated, not by the emergence of a new form of life, but by a universal and unrelenting negativity. On the one hand, this strengthened the reaction, the recoil or retreat into what was passing away or had already perished, and the desire to preserve, restore, resurrect the former fixed, closed shape that had been reduced to ruins and fantastical, romantic recollections. The proletariat embodied this negativity most acutely, both in suffering most acutely from it and in being compelled, out of exasperation with this intolerable condition, to overcome it. For the proletariat, socialism appealed as the theoretical expression of their own revolutionary aspirations. Their desire not to return to an old world, but to realize the promise of a new world that had animated the revolutionary bourgeoisie, a world based upon the freedom from the oppressive dead weight of traditional forms of social life that this revolution had brought about. But that would require overcoming the purely negative, destructive character of this freedom, of realizing a higher form of social life, not as against this process of transformation, but in and through it. In this, the proletariat both criticized the self-contradictory character of bourgeois society and exhibited the self-contradictory character of their own revolutionary struggle, a legacy of the bourgeois revolution whose promise they sought to redeem, and hence whose crisis they both embodied, advanced, and deepened. They thereby inherited the shortcomings of the utopian socialists, that last gasp of bourgeois revolutionary thought, and for that matter, the bourgeois revolutionary tradition of thought more generally, bourgeois philosophy. In that their struggle was seemingly split between the conservative desire to establish a new, stable form of life, and hence to seek inspiration from old forms. Communism, of course, being seen as the oldest, the most primitive, in a sense, form of life, and the revolutionary necessity of abolishing the prevailing state of things. The regressive, reactionary tendency of the bourgeois revolution in crisis manifested not only in the political realm, but also in social activity more generally, including theoretical reflection. The inherent authority of tradition, of inherited ways of thinking, was revived, but no longer in its pure immediacy as simply the given form in which reality appears. It was consciously revived as a means of sheltering thought from the peril of relentless negativity, securing it against the lack of any solid foundation. Thus, there is a regression back into, or an inability to transcend, the traditional form of thought, what Engels called the metaphysical mode of reasoning, what Hegel referred to as the understanding, in which everything must stand either in subordination to fixed determinate concepts or in abstract opposition to them. This was opposed to the form that characterized bourgeois revolutionary thought, whose most systematic articulation was given by Hegel, namely the dialectical mode of reasoning, in which all determinations are grasped in their inherent interconnection and development. In this, revolutionary bourgeois ideology hearkened back to antiquity. As Engels put it, the old Greek philosophers were all born natural dialecticians. Yet while they were able to grasp the general character of the picture of appearances as a whole, they were only able to do so abstractly, lacking a clear idea of the whole picture, a comprehensive grasp of this interconnected totality in its details. Thus, being and becoming, essence and appearance, idea and matter appear abstractly, undialectically opposed. And on this basis, the ancient dialectic appears to have disintegrated. Aristotle had contrasted dialectical with demonstrative reasoning, in that whereas the latter proceeds from premises known to be true through sound inferences to true conclusions, the former deals in premises the truth of which is uncertain, premises derived from the realm of opinion, of mere appearance. It proceeds by testing these premises in theoretical reasoning through argumentation, but also in practical reasoning through action upon the world according to a given understanding. Rather than assuming that these premises must remain fixed, dialectical reasoning tries to deduce conclusions that would contradict these premises, and thus force those who hold said opinions to revise them, bringing these premises thereby closer to truth. For Aristotle, science was demonstrative reasoning that developed a consistent system of deductions from true premises, through which all that is known to be true can be organized into a coherent whole, reflecting the coherence of reality itself. Philosophy, by contrast, sought after the most fundamental premises from which all others could be deduced. Hence, philosophy could take nothing for granted, but proceeded by dialectically testing and refining everything taken to be known as true. As Aristotle put it, dialectic is a process of criticism, wherein lies the path to the, dialectic is a process of criticism, wherein lies the path to the principles of all inquiries. Philosophers were the most dedicated practitioners of this dialectical mode of reasoning, not as against truth in general, as with the sophists, but in the name of establishing the highest truth upon which all knowledge would find an unshakable, firm foundation. Hence, they were not opposed to science and demonstrative reasoning, the philosophers, but freed science from mere inherited opinion as codified in tradition, whose practical shape was domination by irrational political authority, and whose theoretical reflection was the mythological reasoning of religion. It is in this spirit that the young Marx wrote in the preface to his doctoral dissertation, which he actually didn't include in the work itself because of its obviously incendiary nature, as you'll see from what I'm about to read. Philosophy, as long as a drop of blood shall pulse in its world subduing and absolutely free heart, will never grow tired of answering its adversaries with the cry of Epicurus. Not the man who denies the gods worshipped by the multitude, but he who affirms of the gods what the multitude believes about them is truly impious. Philosophy makes no secret of it. The confession of Prometheus, in simple words, I hate the pack of gods, is its own confession, its own aphorism against all heavenly and earthly gods who do not acknowledge human self-consciousness as the highest divinity. It will have none other beside. If classical Greece was philosophical and dialectical, this reflected a crisis and breakdown of the long-established pattern of social life in which individuality, individual freedom, as it were, was subordinated to and nullified within the collective form from which it emerged and upon which it depended. This form first began to consolidate with the rise of settled agricultural civilization, hence the 10,000 year scope of the time frame for this lecture, in which humanity became increasingly dependent not upon nature in its immediacy, but upon nature as transformed by its own activity. We thereby became dependent on the particular forms in which we organized that activity, the active process of our social metabolism with nature. This made it increasingly necessary for society to impose its own necessity upon its individual members, compelling them to do what the community needed them to do to maintain its active life process. It also made it impossible, or pardon me, it also made it possible and necessary to produce more than was needed to simply maintain things as they were, to develop the capacity to secure itself against external threats, whether natural or divine, such as famine, or human, namely war and conquest. This led to the development, on the one hand, of a division of labor within the community between those who produced for immediate needs and those who were concerned with the higher order necessities of maintaining the form of social life. The necessity of war and conquest in particular transformed an external opposition between mutually hostile peoples into an internal division between victors and vanquished, conquerors and conquered, masters and slaves. With slavery, the division of labor attained its purest form, the division between a class of masters who were free from the burden of physical labor because they could command the labor of others, and those who were reduced to tools that could speak, as Aristotle characterized slaves. While in principle capable of self-acting, the fact of their slavery reduced the slaves to mere instruments wielded not by the physical exertion of their masters, but by their thought in the form of orders, commands. Slavery allowed the community to produce in far greater abundance, but this capacity was still limited by the traditional bonds of mutual obligation among the free community. Where the integrity of such traditional forms came into crisis, slavery ultimately made possible a transition to a new form of social organization based not upon the ultimate authority of the community as an integral unity of reproductive activity, of the social metabolism with nature, but that of the individual families embodied in the person of the pater familias, the head of household, obviously the male head of household. The community was no longer primary, but secondary, a product of mutual cooperation between free individuals, whose freedom was, of course, premised on the unfreedom of women, children, and slaves, and foreigners, and others. The latter were bound to the household. The latter were bound to the household as the fundamental unit of agricultural production, while the former were free to convene in the polis and engage in higher forms of activity, art, philosophy, politics. Yet the free men would divide against themselves between the rich who controlled the best tracts of land and the greatest numbers of slaves, and hence enjoyed the greatest degree of freedom, abundance, and power over other free men in the polis, and the poor whose land was poor, who owned few, if any, slaves, and who were liable to be driven into debt and ultimately unable to repay those debts into slavery themselves. The classical case of this development was, of course, ancient Greece, in which the class struggle emerged in its original form. Class struggle in quotation. This is a class struggle in a different sense than the modern sense, but there is obviously an analogy that the Communist Manifesto famously uses as its kind of point of contrast. The plebeians first overthrew the aristocratic rule of the wealthy patricians by raising tyrants to power, seemingly inducing a regression to the domination of the community embodied in the person of a king. Such tyranny was unstable, but culminated in a system of compromises in which the power of the contending classes would be balanced against one another, with the form of this balance codified in law. This too would prove ultimately unstable and grew into a conflict between the respective powers within the Constitution of the aristocratic power of the patricians and the democratic power of the plebeians. Thus, the freedom of the patricians, reflected in the reasoned, critical inquiry of the original philosophers, gave way to the less refined, more crude freedom of the plebeian rabble, who lacked the means to adequately educate, cultivate, and discipline themselves, and who were hence deceived by the chaotic flux of appearances and moved by the chaotic play of opinions, lacking firm foundation, therefore easily manipulated through the sophistry of demagogues. It was this situation that Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle sought to reconcile by restoring the art of dialectic against the destructive tide of sophistry, demagogy, democracy. Ultimately, this unstable situation would collapse, giving way first in Greece with the conquest of Philip and his son Alexander the Great, then in Rome with the fall of the Republic and formation of the empire, which consolidated this regression, this tyranny that sought to preserve the balance between classes by force. Thus, Marx's dissertation was envisioned as the first installment in a series, which he never produced, dealing with the differences between the post-Aristotelian Hellenistic philosophical schools, the Epicureans, the Stoics, the Skeptics, as compared with their pre-Socratic precursors. This dissertation itself focused specifically on the differences between Epicurus and Democritus as post and pre-classical forms, classical in the sense of Plato and Aristotle, post and pre-classical forms of atomism. Marx was not yet a materialist, and following Hegel saw the atomistic materialism in both forms, both pre-Socratic and post-Socratic forms, as necessarily infected with its opposite, the idealism of pure thought. Yet whereas in Democritus, thought was submerged in mere appearance, which it regarded skeptically, seeking to reestablish the substantiality of truth through scientific inquiry, Epicurus made appearance itself the highest truth and championed self-consciousness as the standard by which all things should be measured. Hence his impious and Promethean appeal for Marx. More generally, Marx was concerned with the historical importance of the various Hellenistic systems, despite their seeming regression to pre-Socratic concerns. In lacking the universal range of Plato and Aristotle, unable to rely upon those rich intellectual forms, they were less significant and interesting with respect to their content. But they were more significant and interesting for their subjective form as spiritual as spiritual carriers of the philosophical systems. The collapse of classical Greece destroyed the integrity of the wealth of content cultivated within it, but also drove philosophy out of its submergence in this content into a world to which free subjectivity had to give shape. This was realized in the successor of the Hellenistic philosophy, most importantly that of Stoicism, namely the Christian religion, as the ideological reflection of a new phase in the development of the historical class struggles, or proto-class struggles, if you will. The revolt of the slaves against their masters. Now this, not in the form of a revolution per se, necessarily, this took the form not of a sudden revolution, but of the increasing dependence of the citizens of Rome upon slavery, above all in providing the manpower for the Roman army, through which the empire maintained itself. Yet the growth of the empire's extent also led to a falling supply of slaves, leading the conditions of the slaves to gradually improve and that of the poorer free men to decline, culminating in a new form of unfree labor that, in a sense, was between the two, serfdom. Thus, the dialectic in its original immediate form is based upon the free play of opinions that ultimately reflected and sought to preserve and reproduce a fundamentally unfree form of society, expressed freedom bound within a fixed, closed shape, and could not lead beyond itself. It could only develop in opposition to the triumph of unfreedom over this incipient, undeveloped, superficial form of freedom. So the triumph of the slave revolt of Christianity is, in a sense, in a Nietzschean sense, really, the triumph of slavery over the freedom of the citizens, of the polloi, and of Rome. Continuing the passage from the Grundrisse I quoted above, Marx writes, and this is a bit long, but as Lenin said, oh, pardon me, it's not long yet, but I will get to a longer passage earlier. And as Lenin said, long quotes from Marx are unfortunate but unavoidable. The development of slavery, this is Marx, the development of slavery, the concentration of landed property, exchange, a monetary economy, conquest, etc., had the effect of inducing decay and ruin among the Romans. Though all these elements seemed, up to a certain point, compatible with the basis, in part a mere harmless extension of it, in part mere abuses flowing out of it. Considerable developments are possible here within a particular sphere. Individuals may appear great, but free and full development, either of the individual or of society, is inconceivable here, since such a development stands in contradiction to the original relation. Marx saw a parallel between the crisis and collapse of Greece and classical Greece, and hence the decline of classical Greek philosophy in his own historical moment. Just as the religious veneration of the Olympians, the Olympian gods, gave way to a dialectical investigation of nature, which did not abstractly oppose the substance of knowledge, inherited from tradition as well as derived from experience, but gave impetus to systematic organization and expansion of that knowledge in the form of science. So too had the bourgeois revolution, which emerged from the crisis and collapse of feudalism, begun with the rediscovery of classical antiquity in the Renaissance, and the Protestant revolt against the Catholic Church, giving the impetus to the scientific revolution of the 17th century and the Enlightenment of the 18th. The bourgeois epoch understood itself above all in the philosophy of Hegel as the resurrection of the dialectical and scientific form of thought that had incubated in the explicit unfreedom of the Christian epoch, in the imaginary mythological form of a world beyond, because the slaves were unable to emancipate themselves in this world. They had to, in a sense, project that emancipation into the world beyond. Nonetheless, it had up to that point been above all concerned, the bourgeois epoch, I should say, had been above all concerned with the negative task of criticizing and dispelling the old forms, only rising above those old established forms in the mode of abstract and destructive opposition. Thus, for this epoch, wealth appears to be, this is the remainder of that quote from the Grundrisse, wealth appears to be, in the bourgeois epoch, on the one hand, a thing embodied in things, in material products, which man confronts as subject. On the other hand, wealth as value is simply command over alien labor, not for the purpose of domination, but of private consumption, etc. In all its forms, it appears in physical shape, whether as a thing or as a relationship mediated by a thing, located outside the individual, somewhere near him. In this way, the old view, according to which man always appears in however narrowly national, religious, or political a determination as the end of production, seemed very exalted when set against the modern world, in which production is the end of man and wealth the end of production. In fact, however, if the narrow bourgeois form is peeled off, what is wealth, if not the universality of the individual's needs, capacities, enjoyments, productive forces, etc., produced in universal exchange? What is it, if not the full development of human control over the forces of nature, over the forces of so-called nature, as well as those of his own nature? What is wealth, if not the absolute unfolding of man's creative abilities without any precondition other than the preceding historical development, which makes the totality of this development, i.e., the development of all human powers as such, not measured by any previously given yardstick, an end in itself, through which he does not reproduce himself in any specific character, but produces his totality, and does not seek to remain something he has already become, but is in the absolute movement of becoming. In the bourgeois epoch, and in the epoch of production to which it corresponds, this complete unfolding of man's inner potentiality turns into his total emptying out. His universal objectification becomes his total alienation, and the demolition of all determined, one-sided aims becomes the sacrifice of the human end in itself to a wholly external purpose. That is why, on the one hand, the childish world of antiquity appears as something superior. On the other hand, it is superior wherever fixed shape, form, and established limits are being looked for. It is satisfaction from a narrow standpoint, while the modern world leaves us unsatisfied, or where it does appear to be satisfied with itself, is vulgar and mean. That's the long Marx quote, or the first of, there's another one coming, and then I'll conclude. Marx's dissertation was motivated by the fact that he saw in the rise of the Hellenistic philosophers of self-consciousness an analog of the collapse of the Hegelian school during the 1830s, in the midst of which his young mind took shape, as well as that of Engels. Yet rather than a recrudescence of unfreedom, he saw in the crisis of Hegelian philosophy, rather than a mere recrudescence of unfreedom, I should say, saw in the crisis of Hegelian philosophy the possibility of the dialectic going beyond its worldly limitations, beyond the consolidation of unfreedom, in which freedom is reduced to an imaginary, mythological means of consolation and reconciliation with the prevailing order. Hegel was superior to his own students, according to Marx, in grasping this necessity and raising the dialectical method itself to the level of the highest principle, the sole basis upon which not only theoretical reason in the form of science, but also practical reason in the actual organization of social life could realize its inner essence, namely freedom. Freedom not as abstractly opposed to determinate forms, nor as a mere subordinate moment within a substantial form, but as a process of development in which such forms are overthrown, transcended, transformed, rendered mere moments to be surpassed, mere means serving the ever expanding and ever deepening capacities of thought and activity, which themselves were understood only to be separate moments of the same process, the development of reason within history, as Hegel would put it, as the progress of the consciousness of freedom. It was this education in the Hegelian dialectic, and specifically in the midst of the crisis of the Hegelian school, as the form in which the broader crisis of the bourgeois revolution manifested in Germany, that prepared Marx to recognize the distinctive role of the proletarian class struggle once he encountered it, which will come in the next lecture, the distinctive need for a critical and dialectical clarification of the ideas of the socialists as the essential practical and theoretical moments in an unfolding historical process. So the proletarian class struggle on the one hand, and the ideas of the socialist on the other as those theoretical and practical, or practical and theoretical moments, respectively. I might have got turned around saying that, but you know what I mean. As well as means of undertaking a necessary historical task, that of revolutionary transformation. Yet years before reaching this point in his own development, Marx had already recognized in a footnote to his dissertation the unphilosophical trend in a large section of Hegel's school, among those of his pupils who gave themselves up to it in a naive, uncritical trust. pardon me, among those of his pupils who gave themselves up in a naive, uncritical trust to the ready-made science, only to then reproach the master for a hidden intention behind his insight. The master, to whom the science was not something revealed, not something received, but something in the process of becoming, to whose uttermost periphery his own intellectual heart's blood was pulsating. That's Marx. In so opposing, further quoting Marx, in so opposing their own former condition and ascribing it to Hegel, forgetting, however, that his relation to his system was immediate, substantial, while theirs is only a reflected one, they thereby betrayed their lack of seriousness, according to Marx. He's, of course, talking about the young Hegelians, even before the more famous elements of his critical engagement with them, such as the Holy Family and the German ideology and so on. Marx regarded this unphilosophical trend as a phenomenon which will always accompany the transition from discipline to freedom. He goes on, it is quite thinkable. Okay, so I know I'm kind of over time. I wanted to leave time for questions, but this is the conclusion. This is going to be a bit of a long quote from Marx, and I'll end with this. It is quite thinkable for a philosopher to fall into one or another apparent inconsistency through some sort of accommodation. He himself may be conscious of it, but what he is not conscious of is the possibility that this apparent accommodation has its deepest roots in an inadequacy or in an inadequate formulation of his principle itself. Suppose, therefore, that a philosopher has really accommodated himself, then his pupils must explain from his inner essential consciousness that which for him himself had the form of an exoteric consciousness. In this way, that which appears as progress of conscience is at the same time progress of knowledge. No suspicion is cast upon the particular conscience of the philosopher, but his essential form of consciousness is construed, raised to a definite shape and meaning, and in this way also transcended. It is a psychological law that the theoretical mind, once liberated in itself, turns its practical energy and, leaving the shadowy empire of Amenthys as will, turns itself against the reality of the world existing without it. From a philosophical point of view, however, it is important to specify these aspects better, since from the specific manner of this turn, we can reason back toward the imminent determination and the universal historic character of a philosophy. We see here, as it were, its curriculum vitae narrowed down to its subjective point. But the practice of philosophy is itself theoretical. It is the critique that measures the individual existence by the essence, the particular reality by the idea. But this immediate realization of philosophy is in its deepest essence afflicted with contradictions, and this, its essence, takes form in the appearance and imprints its seal upon it. When philosophy turns itself as will against the world of appearance, then the system is lowered to an abstract totality. That is, it has become one aspect of the world which opposes another one. Its relationship to the world is that of reflection. Inspired by the urge to realize itself, it enters into tension against the other. The inner self-contentment and completeness has been broken. What was inner light has become consuming flame turned outwards. The result is that as the world becomes philosophical, philosophy also becomes worldly. That its realization is also its loss. That what it struggles against on the outside is its own inner deficiency. That in the very struggle, it falls precisely into those defects which it fights as defects in the opposite camp, and that it can overcome these defects by falling, and that it can only overcome these defects by falling into them. That which opposes it and that which it fights is always the same as itself, only with the factors inverted. This is the one side when we consider this matter purely objectively as immediate realization of philosophy. However, it has also a subjective aspect, which is merely another form of it. This is the relationship of the philosophical system which is realized to its intellectual carriers, to the individual self-consciousnesses in which its progress appears. This relationship results in what confronts the world in the realization of philosophy itself, namely the fact that these individual self-consciousnesses always carry a double-edged demand, one edge turned against the world, the other against philosophy itself. Indeed, what in the thing itself appears as a relationship inverted in itself appears in these self-consciousnesses as a double one, a demand and an action contradicting each other. Their liberation of the world from unphilosophy is at the same time their own liberation from the philosophy that held them in fetters as a particular system. Since they are themselves engaged merely in the act and immediate energy of development, and hence have not yet theoretically emerged from that system, they perceive only the contradiction with the plastic equality with self of the system, and do not know that by turning against it, they only realize its individual moments. And that I'll conclude. I'm sorry I went a little longer than I hoped. Hopefully we have some time for questions, discussion, so on.
Reid, that was fabulous. And you did in fact leave us with 15 minutes of time for questions. So
I'll try to leave more on the next session. Sorry, I'm long-winded, but thank you.
yeah, we've got Danny on deck immediately with a question. Go ahead, Danny.
Hi, Reid. Thanks for the introduction and this first class lecture. I just wanted to see if I could get a few things right. So this is a very quick question. So would you say that there's still, in your view, Marx was still not at a kind of Feuerbachian materialism? Like, I forget exactly when Engels says we're all Feuerbachians now, when he's talking later about like Marx. I guess I forget exactly when that happens, but I bring that up because, of course, a lot of Marx's writings in 1842 have a kind of, it's like Hegelian in the sense of, well, the problem with the divorce bill is that it's like irrational, right? It's trying to give a religious essence to something that's secular. Obviously, a lot of things about the freedom of speech. And I think even he says at the end of some of these Rheinische articles, things like, we're demanding a rational state, right? Which would be definitely very much Hegelian language. And the reason I bring that up is because I know, and I guess maybe this will come up next week, Feuerbach for Marx is like symptomatic of the self-contradiction of the dialectic, that it's as if the dialectic itself seems to be reflected. So if you're familiar with your Hegel, I know Reid you are, but just for the audience, it's almost as if they've regressed to reflection in and out of the dialectic itself, as if the dialectic's own critique. And you read from Marx's dissertation at the end, where he's saying, well, look, these young Hegelians are not even considering that you have to kind of recover Hegel. You can't just say, oh, he's one-sided here. The whole question is how the critique itself is mediated. So maybe just to repeat the questions, one, would you say it's not quite yet taken up the Feuerbachian materialism here? And then two, how do you think Marx is kind of thinking about things at this time in terms of this crisis of Hegelianism related to his liberalism? Right.
It's so honestly, Danny, I don't want to seem like I'm evading the question. That is pretty much the starting point of the next lecture. And it's also a topic I did address to some extent in my previous lecture for the School of Materialist Research a few years ago, if anyone's interested. I'll briefly say no, but also I don't think he ever really was a Feuerbachian materialist per se.
Can I interrupt?
Yeah.
Just quickly, of course, I mean, it is like a symptom. Like when he says we're all Feuerbachians now, in the same way that Marx becomes a communist to be the greatest critic of communism who's ever existed. Like, in other words, they're going in with the self-critique of it. But that's all I meant.
So let me put it this way. I think it's a mistake to understand materialism and idealism, for that matter, for Marx as philosophical positions or metaphysical positions. And I guess you could kind of think of them as like meta-philosophical positions in a way. I'll get into that more maybe in the next lecture. It's somewhere in the future. But generally speaking, I don't think Marx ever really, at least with respect to these questions, I don't think he ever broke with the position that you find in, for example, the passages from his dissertation I just read. And I selected those passages in particular to try to bring that out. And I'll emphasize that in a forthcoming lecture. But basically, I think he always recognized Feuerbach was a symptom. And I think he also, for that matter, always recognized Bruno Bauer was a symptom and so on. I don't think there's this idea that like first Marx was like a Bauerite, and then he became a Feuerbachian, and then he became a Marxist. I don't look at it that way. And I'll explain more so why in the next lecture. But it's really, I think the confusion here has to do with what exactly we even mean by these terms, materialism and idealism. Because if you try to read that in a kind of traditional philosophical way when looking at Marx, he really becomes incoherent. And that's sort of to some extent what I was alluding to in that opening section of the lecture regarding the ways in which like practice, there's an idea of like the subordination of theory to practice, of like determinism, materialism in that sense. But I'll try to address that question, or I will address that question more substantively in the next lecture. So.
Other questions? So Reid, I have one. If I might jump in while others generate additional ones.
Please.
But yeah, I'm really interested in hearing you perhaps unpack a little bit more of one of the opening gambits you gave us.
Sure.
And specifically, what I think you're doing that really nuances the discourse around the mobilization of the working classes within revolutionary materialist philosophy, right? And I really liked the way that you're speaking to, right, a sort of autonomy, respect for recognition of, right, these individuals, both as a collectivity and one that should not be thought of as cannon fodder. So yeah, I'm interested in you speaking a little bit more to that in terms of revolutionary theory and practice.
Well, that's what motivates this entire project, is trying to kind of get a grip on that dynamic for Marx, and also in doing so, throwing into critical light the way in which that dynamic is botched in contemporary understandings of Marxism. Again, as I put it, kind of from both sides, from kind of the pro and anti-Marxist sides. They both, in a sense, see it the same way, but just attached, positive and negative values to it, respectively. This is really so. The kind of opening spiel was my attempt to set up this entire series, and it's motivated by a kind of understanding of history that is rooted in the classical Marxist tradition. It's rooted in Marx and Engels themselves, as well as their sort of what I would, and not only I would think of as like their best followers in the immediate following generations. Above all, Rosa Luxemburg, Leon Trotsky, and really Lenin is above all, and that is continued in the wake of the kind of crisis and disintegration, or kind of at the very moment of the crisis and disintegration, like the moment that the failure to resolve the crisis sort of induces disintegration in the socialist movement, with the works of Karl Korsch, specifically his Marxism and Philosophy, as well as Georg Lukács, specifically his History and Class Consciousness. Those works from like the early to mid 20s, both of them broke with those positions and kind of became something else afterwards, but I'm specifically talking about those works, that period. And then following them, the Frankfurt School, especially Adorno and Horkheimer, and more recently, my own education in this history and this way of looking at the history from Chris Catrone and the Platypus Affiliated Society, which I'm a member of, and that's kind of where I got my understanding of the history. I've been struggling with understanding Marx both on his own terms, in a sense, from a philosophical perspective. That's how I was introduced to Marxism when I was a teenager, as a philosopher. So I've been trying to make sense of that I was trying to make sense of that for like almost a decade, before I kind of encountered this kind of, I gradually kind of approached this kind of understanding of the history of Marxism, the politics of Marxism, as not as like a separate subject from Marxism as a kind of theory or philosophy, but as like integrally related to the theory, not only as regards the content, but there is, in a sense, an integral relationship at the level of form between theory and practice, or at least there was for Marxism. And that integral relationship fell apart. And that's a historical process. It wasn't because of, or I would argue, and I'm not unique in this, it's not because of like theoretical errors. And it's also not like exactly because of practical errors, although there were certainly practical errors. And frankly, you can argue there were theoretical errors as well, if you'd like. But ultimately, it's kind of more complicated than putting it just that way. And the problem is, over the last 100 years, since the crisis of Marxism as a movement, as a historical phenomenon, we've kind of had this process through which everyone, not just Marxists and socialists and leftists and what have you, but really everyone in society that's at least at all trying to digest the history of the 20th century in some sort of critical way, critical in sort of scare quotes, we all have to try to grapple with this phenomenon, because the fact of the matter is Marxism did change the world radically, dramatically, just not in the way it intended to. It changed the world by failing to change the world in the way it intended to. And how and why that happened is very difficult to make sense of. I'm not claiming I have an adequate grasp of it at all. But what I do think is obvious is that the efforts to understand it on both sides, both for and against Marxism, haven't really amounted to anything, at least not anything in the sense that we can say the problem to which Marxism was a response, capitalism, if you will, it's still an open problem that's creating all sorts of, that's reflected in all sorts of ways in thought and in activity in society. And not in a way that's like coherent or necessarily leading in any direction beyond just reproducing the same thing, but in ever more degraded forms. So
that's a really, really fascinating answer and gives us a lot to continue to work with. I think we've got time for one more question and one more answer. Does anyone want to pick up on that thread? Or throw down a new gauntlet?
I don't like the unanimity. Come on, challenge me, somebody.
All right. Danny says next time more challenges. I'll agree with that. Reid, I know you agree with that. We'll keep this thing going. And yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, I will try to manage my time better next time. I did end up kind of pushing off material from this lecture into the next one, so I don't know, maybe that won't work, but I did have a lot to cover in this one, and so I'll do my best. But thank you all for being part of this. It's I'm very excited and very grateful for all the interest and for and to the School of Materialist Research for having me. I'm honored and very, very grateful. So
Yeah. All right. We'll see you all right back here next week. Cheers.
Great job, Reid.
thank you.